Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Dad Hab Live. I am your host, Joe Messeri, and I appreciate you listening, tuning in, watching this however you are, or listening to this however you are. We always appreciate it. I'm really excited about today's conversation, and I guess, Tyler, I should start this one by saying hello, neighbors. Because we are going to be learning from the lessons of Mr. Rogers today, thanks to our two great guests, Gregg Behr and Ryan Rydzewski. How'd I do there, Ryan?
That was far better than most people's first attempt. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. They are the co-authors of When You Wonder You're Learning, and I'm going to work on that throughout this year. Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. Really appreciate it.
It's an honor to be here.
Yeah,
I feel like
really
we need intro music like you had to our everydays. That was pretty great.
You know, I think the music, the name of that song is titled like The Cool Dad or something like that. And when we were doing this, like, I didn't even care what it sounded like. When I saw the title on there, I was like, this has to be the intro music to the podcast that we're going to be doing here. So it just worked out that I happen to like the song as well. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Gentlemen, I want to start here with, I guess, a little bit about how you guys came to work together and the common bond over Mr. Rogers and his lessons that seems to have united you.
Well, the common bond comes from the fact that we're both Western Pennsylvania kids. And for those who might know a bit about Fred Rogers and his work, he filmed Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood right here at WQED, America's first public television station, based here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so we start from a place that we're Western Pennsylvania kids, grew up with Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers is certainly in the DNA of Western Pennsylvania. And Ryan and I have had the privilege of working together in our work at the Gregg Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation endeavoring to support the well-being of children, families, and educators here in southwestern Pennsylvania. We've worked together for a little over 5 years now. And it's some of the work that we've been privileged to be engaged with that really dates back over the past decade and a half. That was the spark for this book about Fred Rogers and his blueprints for learning.
So in your book, you have a foreword there by Joanne Rogers, and I was just kind of marveling at her description of Fred and the way she talked about him as being kind, but that it was something that he had to work at. And I really think about that because it seems like it just came so naturally to him and that it was effortless. So I'm curious there if you can talk a little bit about your learning and discovery when it came to his work, about what went on behind the scenes to make it seem so effortless every day on television.
Sure. So there's a great line in that forward from Joanne, which we are so privileged and honored to have from her, that says, nobody worked harder at being Fred Rogers than Fred Rogers. And I really think that encapsulates the thrust of the book, which is that being like Fred or following in Fred's footsteps is a practice. It's a daily practice. It's something Fred worked at every single day. And you're right. Sometimes it seems that it just came really naturally to him. And in some ways that can be intimidating. Or you could think, well, I don't have this gift that Fred had, so I don't need to worry about it. But the thing is, Fred didn't have any sort of supernatural gift for being nice. He worked at it every single day, and he left us his blueprints. He left us his methods for doing similar things in ways that are authentic to us. And what we've tried to do in this book is really elucidate the how behind the neighborhood. How did he become this person we all know is this person who made us feel warm and welcome and made us feel like we belong and that we matter? Again, he had a method to all of this. Everything he did in the neighborhood was grounded in science. And so what we've tried to do is not only highlight some of that science for readers, but also give them some examples of how Rogers applied it and how parents, teachers, educators, anyone who works with kids today can apply it in their own ways.
And we'll get into that science in a little bit. But before we do, I just want to talk about one more thing from that intro, and was talking about his ability to be authentic. And in my other life, I'm a journalist as well, Ryan, there. And so I've been doing some work on Yogi Berra lately and just thinking about what made him so appealing to so many people was the ability to be his authentic self. And I'm curious, because I think so many people struggle with that now, right? We talk about the masks that we wear in public. And I'm curious, is there anything out of your research for this book that stood out that helped him be his authentic self every day out there?
It goes back to that line that Joanne wrote about him. No one practiced being Fred Rogers more than Fred Rogers himself. And it was the routines that he established in his own life and the way that he awoke each day, thinking about what is it that I need to do to prepare for this day, and being in prayer and meditation and thinking about the people with whom he was going to interact. I mean, he genuinely practiced what it was that he did. And he was his authentic self, right? For him, Mr. Rogers wasn't a character. It was him, his presence as a caring adult in that experience one-on-one with that child, that singular child in that other television screen on the other side of that camera. And he was very deliberate and intentional about being who he was, but about being who he was all of the time. And I think Joanne hit it in the sense that when she said it's a practiced behavior. There wasn't an assumption that he was good and that it was a lifelong work.
Yeah.
Fred used to say that, we all have different gifts. And so we all have different ways of sharing with the world who we are. And Fred himself had lots of different gifts. He was a wonderfully gifted musician. In fact, his undergraduate degree was in music composition. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He got ordained right here in Pittsburgh, right down the road from where he was filming The Neighborhood. He was a wonderfully gifted artist, and he was a brilliant scientist. And we see all of these things at play: the music, the art, the religion and theology and philosophy coming together in these really wonderful ways in Fred Rogers, the man, and in how he expressed those gifts in The Neighborhood.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the science, and you kind of outlined some themes in the book: curiosity, creativity, communication, collaboration, failure, and connection. Kind of breaks it down there. So I want to start with the science behind curiosity, and I thought it was so interesting in the book how you kind of used the example of Google to help establish leaders and managers in there. And I think it's so ironic that we have a technology company that is using data and technology and engineering to figure out humanity, right? Which is what it tells us we need more of. So I thought that was so fascinating. But what did the results of that Google study tell you? And why is it so impactful for parents and people out there who are dealing with children?
Sure. So there are actually two Google studies in the book. The first one was Project Oxygen, which was a really interesting study. And what Google was trying to figure out was what makes the best managers, what makes the best leaders within the company. They had assumed, I think, as a lot of people would, that the best managers were simply the best engineers, the people who knew the most stuff, the people who could write computer code in their sleep. But they wanted to validate that approach because it's Google, after all, they're scientists. So they analyzed I think it was 10,000 data points, trying to figure out, okay, what are the patterns here? What are the things that help our leaders become great leaders? And what they realized was, in fact, technical expertise, knowing things was important. But in the 8 competencies that they discovered were most important, expertise came dead last. The more important things were things that you just outlined: curiosity, creativity, collaboration. Do you care about your coworkers? Can you think through complex questions? Can you make people feel like they belong, that they're safe, that they're valued? All of these things that Fred Rogers spent decades teaching us how to do in The Neighborhood.
And so,
Joe, can I interrupt with,
please?
Because I think it's important. I think we need to put a pin in something, because we're using the name Fred Rogers and scientist in the same sentence, which is not a way that we think about Fred Rogers.
Right.
Right. And that was really our aha, and why, in fact, we wrote this book. Those of us who watch the show, know Fred Rogers as that loving, caring personality on the other side of our screen, right? And he was that. He was all of that. He was someone deeply grounded in child development theory and practice. And he studied with child development experts here in Pittsburgh at a time when you had folks like Margaret McFarland, Eric Erickson, Benjamin Spock. I mean, this is a pantheon of child development practitioners of the 20th century. He was grounded in what we would describe as whole child theory, not a phrase that they used 50 years ago. And our aha in writing this book is really seeing Fred as an engineer, someone who created that seamless learning environment, Joe, that you described, and being very deliberate and intentional about it. And today we call that the learning sciences, what we're learning about learning itself. And so I think it's important as we, as in this conversation of how is it that we talk about Fred as a scientist, because that is a new way to look at his work.
Yeah, and I love the example you used. I think you said something like it would be like Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach playing music together at the same time. For me, it resonated. I read Steve Jobs' biography, and the idea of just being in the right place at the right time in Silicon Valley with, all of the chips that were being created then, and obviously finding Wozniak as his running mate there to create that company. But that's so important in finding the right person, the right time, and the right opportunity. And it seems like that was the perfect storm as it pertained to Mr. Rogers.
And it's interesting that if you look at the latest research now on what we're learning about learning, if you talk to some of the top learning scientists, if you read the latest research papers, if you go to learning science conferences, what scientists are saying at first glance doesn't sound very scientific. They're not talking about charts or what they're measuring. They're not showing you graphs. Instead, they're talking about how do we make sure kids feel safe? How do we make sure kids feel loved? How do we make sure that they feel that they're part of a community that values them? When you read these papers, when you talk to these people, they sound less like scientists and they sound more like a scriptwriter in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah. I'm curious because I feel like we get an accordion effect with these things where we've seen about teaching skills of interpersonal relations like empathy, and then you get to teaching toward the test where just that data and the numbers become so important. And then I feel like we're kind of accordioning back in, if you will, and saying, okay, we need to teach people, right? And we need to connect with people now. So I'm curious how, one, you think you see that playing out right now in terms of schooling systems around the country, and I know there's a lot of variation within that. And two, what they can learn from what Mr. Rogers taught us and what he studied as a scientist.
Yeah. So the answer to what you described is all of the above. Right? We need all of those things in learning landscapes and in particular in our schools for our kids. And certainly there are things as a society we want to achieve on behalf of schools and the students in those schools. As we look at this pandemic, and ideally we're looking at a post-pandemic learning moment, the reason that we feel so strongly about these blueprints that Fred Rogers left us is because he came up with a very simple equation that should guide us as we look forward. And that is what is timeless and classic combined with what is innovative and future facing. I mean, there was a radical side to Fred Rogers who understood what was attractive to young people and what their needs. And at the time, it was the newfangled technology of television. Right. And he said, how do I make this good and constructive? So he recognized the timeless and classic role of deep and caring relationships, something that we need in our schools. But he also understood what it was that was attractive and what connected with their passions and interests. And the best educators in our schools, in our museums, in our libraries and early learning centers and beyond are in fact simply using that equation in brilliant ways. And I think part of our charge right now in this post-pandemic moment, or getting to this post-pandemic moment, is thinking about what are the structures that we put in place. I'll give you a very concrete example. What if schools, as a typical thing, had directors of relationships? Now, 10 years ago, there weren't directors of instructional innovation. There's now such a position. We invest in humans in schools in that way. What if there was someone who nothing but 24/7 was thinking about the social capital and the opportunities that kids have, particularly the opportunities that kids who, for economic reasons, don't have the same opportunities as their peers, and someone, not a counselor, which is important, not a teacher, which is important, but a director of relationships, supporting them in that school environment and building out those relationships that then help connect them to the things that are innovative and future-facing, that then drive curiosity and creativity.
Let me ask you, let me interrupt you for one sec there, Greg, because I'm curious. Is there, and I keep using that word over and over again, lifelong learners is one of the terms we use here at the Dad Habit, so I was happy to see that come out in your book as well. But Is that because you are on the cutting edge, because you're involved in some of the progressive movements in education there? Is that happening at certain schools? Do you have a director of relationships in public school or private school settings right now?
It's not typical, but it's not unheard of. But what I can tell you, there are school districts right here in southwestern Pennsylvania, and not well-resourced school districts, that because of their pandemic experience, whether it's the Fort Cherry School District in rural Pennsylvania or the Northgate School District here in the urban core of Pittsburgh, they're thinking about how they invest differently in the caring adults in that school setting to support kids and their learning futures. So I think some of these things that are atypical now, if we do things right, will become more typical as we look ahead.
And I think one of the things we're also realizing is that learning doesn't just happen in schools. Learning happens everywhere. And this is something that Rogers showed us for decades. You know, it was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, not necessarily Mr. Rogers' classroom. Every episode, we went to go meet people doing all sorts of interesting things. We met architects, we met athletes, we met bakers, we met restaurant workers. We went to different factories to see how people make things. Rogers understood that learning, especially forging a lifelong love of learning, can happen in the classroom, but it doesn't happen solely in the classroom. And we're starting to see a lot more of that, a lot more acceptance of that philosophy and a lot more enthusiasm for that philosophy today. You know, Rogers himself was once asked, if you have an educational television program, why aren't you focusing on fractions and spelling words and the things we typically think of when we think of education and learning? And Rogers said, you know, I'd rather give children the tools for learning. And those tools for learning are what you just mentioned earlier: curiosity, creativity, collaboration, and more. He said, if we give children the tools, then they'll want to learn the facts. And more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. And I think Rogers recognized that those tools for learning can be forged anywhere: classrooms, museums, libraries, even our own living rooms.
Right. And I love the way you use that, to build and not destroy. In the book, you mentioned you can use an alphabet to write a declaration of war or describe a sunset. And I mean, that was so impactful to me. And we right now are seeing in censorship and misinformation and, you know, having the ability to understand where your information is coming from and to be able to learn and verify things for yourself, I feel like is more important now than it may have ever been before. You touched on the post-pandemic educational environment. I'm very curious, what do you think is going to be the biggest takeaway from what we've seen with so much of this remote learning when kids are finally back in school full-time in the more traditional setting, or will it be traditional anymore once they return to the classroom?
Well, there's certainly going to be a gravitational pull to what is traditional and what was. I think schools will be forever changed, and their experiences with technology-enhanced learning, with their experiences with being flexible about schedules, I think there are things that will be forever changed. I'm hopeful that the thing that is most changed is the interaction between schools and families. Certainly in that first spring of the pandemic, parents built up all sorts of empathy about what it is that's actually happening in schools.
Right.
And school teachers also, because of their largely Zooming experience, got a glimpse into households in a way that they never had before. And so they've built up empathy too. So I'm hopeful that on the two sides of parents and educators, that there's this new empathy about what's possible. And the other thing that's really exciting to me, we've seen study after study from the Brookings Institution and elsewhere that more than 2/3 of parents now say they want learning to happen differently on the other side of this pandemic. Well, when you have that sort of parent demand and you have that sort of parent expectation, well, that suddenly gives school boards and schools the courage to do things differently and at least to experiment with some new ways and new approaches to learning, which might extend from a differently designed and flexible school day and how we use hours and bell schedules to actually how we're delivering with pedagogies of technology-enhanced learning or project-based learning or community-wide learning like Ryan describes, and genuine partnerships across schools, museums, and libraries to create learning pathways for kids.
All right, let me build on that. And before Ryan, if you jump in there, because just one more question on that, because we talk about the neighborhood, right? We know the saying, it takes a village. Do you think, because I feel like getting the parent and family involvement in schools and having that relationship go both ways now is also going to take the neighborhood to buy into that, right? Whether it's our employers, our government, and, you know, knowing that our work schedules are going to change or be more adaptable. Do you think we have gone through enough of a hardship and a realization that we will see that on the other side so that parents can prioritize that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think if the pandemic showed us anything, it's that the way things are isn't necessarily the way things have to be. And like Gregg said, teachers and parents have now gotten a glimpse into each other's homes, into each other's lives. They probably have a better understanding now of what kids need. You know, aside from academics, what do children need to thrive? They need their basic needs met. They need to be in a place where they feel comfortable, where they feel safe, where they feel like they belong. And I think more and more we're going to see people recognizing, again, that all of us have a role to play in creating those spaces, that all of us have a role to play in helping children feel like Mr. Rogers did, safe, comfortable, warm, ready to learn. There's a quote in the book from Dr. Valerie Kinloch, who's she's the dean of the School of Education here at the University of Pittsburgh. And she, in the book, discusses the moment when she realized she loved to learn. She was a little girl in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm just going to read the quote because it says, "I realized that people around me were a series of books that I hadn't been reading. Everything my teachers were trying to teach me was always right in front of me. I didn't have to open a book to read it. I could just sit and listen to the conversations happening on the front porches or at the kitchen table or even in the hallways at school. And when I realized that, that's when I fell deeply in love with learning." And I love that quote because it demonstrates to me the excitement for Rogers' philosophy, which was, again, learning happens everywhere. All of us have a role to play in being educators. All of us have a role to play in helping children grow up in healthy, positive ways. The more of us that are working together on this, whether it's with our own children or our neighbors' children, I think the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, that's a
And Joe, if I may,
go ahead, Greg.
Well, this conversation, I love this. So it's
Me too.
also
I'm geeking out over here.
So our future doesn't spring out of nowhere, right? There are always signals about what's possible. And so what I'm noticing now in education and learning signals is people pointing to places like Hamilton County in Tennessee, centered on Chattanooga, or San Diego, or Chicago, or right here in Pittsburgh, where for years, if not more than a decade, there has been intensive community-based work of genuinely connecting and finding ways to connect the caring adults, the teachers in the schools, with the museum directors, with the after-school youth workers, of creating a more seamless learning environment that supports the learners themselves and then also their parents, families, and caregivers. And so I think when we look to our future, we can look to learning landscapes where, you know what, they've actually been trying to embrace this idea of learning happens everywhere in places like Chattanooga or in San Diego. And how are those signals about what might happen across America?
You know, my mother is a retired educator now. She actually just retired a couple months ago. And she taught fifth grade in the New York City public school system for a really long time. And one of the things that she realized, I think she always had a little bit of an understanding of what some of her students were going through at home and the situation there, because she didn't grow up with a lot of money. She was one of 6 children, you know, in a family that always just had to make ends meet, and the youngest. And so she kind of empathized with that because she had hand-me-down clothes. And, you know, my uncle tells the joke that they didn't realize there was supposed to be something in between the 2 pieces of bread and a sandwich until he went into the military. But they always found a way to get it done and make ends meet. So I still remember if we ever had an extra winter coat, or if there were clothes, like she knew who the kid in her class was who really needed that. And you touch on the book about the importance of children feeling safe to be able to take those leaps of curiosity and adventure. And I wonder, how can we foster that a little bit more? Because we've seen the divide, right? The digital divide and the economic divide that exists in our education system and just in our world because of this pandemic. So how can we help make kids feel safe, especially in an educational setting?
So as a fellow former 5th grade teacher, I absolutely know what your mom went through, and I appreciate everything she's done for her students. You know, no educator needs to be told, especially now, that trauma is widespread, that what we've come to call adverse childhood experiences are widespread. Kids are going through really, really difficult things economically, racially, whether or not they feel safe in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their schools. Kids are grappling with so much. And what we've seen through the science as we researched this book, that regardless of what a child goes through, the best remedy to adverse childhood experiences, the best way to be resilient in the face of trauma, it all comes down to the role of caring adults and how well those caring adults can build relationships, can build routines that make children feel safe, and give children a sense that they matter. And again, this is what we saw Rogers doing in the neighborhood day in and day out. He always came in the same way. He always took off his suit and put on the warm sweater. He always changed his shoes. He always ended the same way. We saw these routines for 40 years because he knew that routines help kids feel safe. We saw him put on a sweater for 40 years because we knew that that signifies warmth, that it signifies this is a safe place. We're going to relax together. And I think the more attention we can pay as educators to those sort of non-academic, but very important to academic things, the importance of environment, the importance of belonging, the importance of safety. We have to start with that. And especially after this pandemic in which so many lives have been upended, we have to start with that. We have to focus on that. We have to support that through policy. And we have to prioritize it with our time.
I love the part in the book where you talk about Coco the gorilla taking off his shoes because it had become such habit. Like that was just what you did there. And that is so important to me because with the dad habit, what we focus on is building that routine, right, for adults and specifically fathers so that they can pass that on to their children and that they can kind of take care of themselves so that they can take care of those around them. And you kind of touch on that a little bit in the book. You say that we need to be curious ourselves because that curiosity is contagious. You talk about how it's hard to admit what you don't know, especially as an adult. It's a little bit easier for children, I think, to do that. But you also, in the intro there, quote something from The Little Prince, which is one of my favorite books I read to my son, and I read it when I was in high school in French and absolutely loved it. But what is most essential we can't see with our eyes, right, is invisible to the eyes or something along those lines. I'm misquoting and I feel terrible there about that. But there's a book that was kind of an inspiration to us called Atomic Habits. And I'm reminded of the blacksmith who's hammering away at the stone. And for the first 999 hits, there's nothing. And then on that 1,000th hit, it cracks and it goes through. But it wasn't the 1,000th hit, it was the 999th before. So I'm curious for parents and for educators, because a lot of these things that you're doing every day, you're not going to see those immediate results, especially what's inside for the children that you're dealing with. So how do you encourage parents and educators to, I guess, stick with it, right? To know that they are traveling down the right path, to know that Mr. Rogers may not connect with you on day one. It probably felt weird the first day he got on television, but 30 years later, it's like, I can't go without seeing this guy come into the house.
So I love this question, and I'll acknowledge too, I read Le Petit Prince in French too, although I could never imagine doing that now. So,
me either, don't worry. My son actually is counting now in Spanish to 10, and he was like, he was curious about other languages, so I still remembered how to count to 10 in French, and then he's asking me about all these other languages and why I don't know how to count to 10 in them. I said, let's figure it out together. So we're counting to 10 in a lot of languages in my house, but that's the extent of my French, I feel like, that's stuck with me.
You just captured it, Joe, right? Like, let's figure this out together. I don't pretend to be a perfect dad. Ryan doesn't pretend to be a perfect teacher. So let me just say that right up front. And we have been challenged by this book ourselves. But I'll give you 3 very quick examples of this idea that attitudes are caught, which was so central to the work of Margaret McFarland, who worked with Fred Rogers so closely. So first, I used to be a skateboarder. And in the early months of the pandemic, I found myself in my garage, which looks like a scene from Hoarders, and I found my old Madrid skateboard, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to put on my skateboard. I'm not going to bother to put on my helmet, which is probably a bad idea, and I'm just going to start skating down the street. I mention this to say, you can imagine that sort of laughter and hysterical moment I had as a nearly 50-year-old guy, like skating down the street, no pads, like, oh my gosh, am I about to break my leg? And I got to the end of the street, and the kids are running behind me, and now 8 kids in the neighborhood, 8 girls, all skateboard. And it's, I'm not sure I can draw a line from A to B, but I pretty closely can. And it's because they notice that joy. So one, kids notice the joy and the things that bring you joy in what you're doing. 2, they notice your curiosity and your persistence. Think about things you might be doing in your kitchen, working on a new recipe, or building something out in your garage. And it's rare that you get something done right the first time. And I think of all of those moments, we're building Legos with my girls, or we're trying something and we're like, oh, that didn't turn out right. Like, let's try it again. How else would you do it? What do you think we could try, right? Asking questions like that and really inviting them into that iterative design experience of trying something, and especially when it's something new. The third thing is really acknowledging when we don't have answers. And I've shared this a number of times, and this is a really sort of profound moment for me as a dad. Some months ago, I was lying on my living room floor watching NCAA basketball games, and my daughter, who I should acknowledge is of mixed race, leaned into my right ear in a very unexpected moment and said, "Daddy, am I going to be shot?" And she had asked that question a few days after shootings of Asian Americans in Atlanta. And it was clear to me at that moment, the news from Atlanta had gotten into my household here in Pittsburgh. And that was a really hard moment, like a moment totally unlike that skateboard, right? This was a moment, and my heart froze. I didn't know what to do exactly at that moment. And it was like the lessons of this book came, rushing home to me. One, I needed to acknowledge the question. I couldn't pretend like, oh, I didn't hear that one. Like, right? Like I had to acknowledge it. I had to notice it. I had to convey to her that she was physically and psychologically safe. And I had to acknowledge that, I don't know the answer, but we're going to think about this, wonder about this, talk about this together. And that was a hard moment. I'm not sure how I did, but it's an example when we think about the lessons of Fred Rogers and those moments, whether it's as a teacher or as a dad right at home, at different moments, how those lessons are so important and how we really embrace thinking aloud together and acknowledging when we have joy, acknowledging when we have questions, and acknowledging when we don't know the answers.
Right. I know that's got to be incredibly difficult. And I've been dealing with death and talking about that as we lost a pet recently, not to put it on on the same scale as all, but just those difficult conversations. And thinking about the cat example that you use of in the book about Mr. Rogers asking about when he was a child about birth and where do kittens come from. Sometimes the truth, and maybe not the entirety of the truth, but just giving a little bit of understanding and validating that their questions can be so important there.
And I know that one of Ryan's favorite episodes is the death of the goldfish.
Yeah, it's interesting that Rogers, he confronted this very problem that you're talking about, which is you don't always know if and when you're connecting. You don't always know if what you're doing is working, whether you're a parent or a teacher or anyone else who works with kids. Rogers himself was in front of a television camera in a quiet television studio. And this is something that he thought about a lot. You can't hear who's on the other side of that. You can't see who's on the other side of that. And so the way he did it, the way he tried to connect with his audience was through the mail. The first thing he did when he got to the office every morning was answer the mail that came in, sometimes up to 50 or 100 letters a day from children. And if you go to the Fred Rogers Center in Latrobe, all of this correspondence is still stored. And it's stunning and heartbreaking in many ways what children and older folks from around the country were sharing with Rogers. And with the intense attention to detail with which he responded to every single one of them. I think the lesson there is that you have to seek out and take your feedback where you can get it. The executive director of the Fred Rogers Center, which is where that mail is stored, shared a story with us when we were researching the book. Her daughter, a new sibling had recently come into the house, and her older daughter was having some trouble. But Roberta didn't know that. She thought everything was going fine. And daughter at school drew a picture of her new baby sister. And Roberta got it and said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And the teacher said, "Well, look on the back. Look what she titled it." And her daughter had called it like the hand of the monster or something like that, calling her little baby sister the monster. And what Roberta said is, kids sometimes speak in code, and what they're really thinking, what they're really feeling, sometimes it will come out very directly, as it did with the case of Gregg's daughters. Sometimes it will come out in sort of obscure ways that take a lot of deep listening. And Fred modeled that for us, again, in the neighborhood, in the way he listened to and responded to all of those letters.
Yeah. I think about the example you use, I think it was from the 15 or 1600s, of the description of children as vile creatures, thieves, and liars in there, just to talk about that generational gap and that exists, which I think her sister could probably empathize with there. I'm curious because you talked about figuring this out together, right, Gregg? And I know that you're doing some of that work over at the Grable Foundation and with Remake Learning. So can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on to, I guess, try and figure out the future of education and where we might see this going?
Yeah, so this book springs forth from 15 years of work here in the southwestern and northern West Virginia, southwestern Pennsylvania region. And it's a network that in 2021 consists of more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, after-school programs, higher education, creative industries, collectively thinking about what is relevant, what is engaging, what is equitable and just as we think about learning opportunities for children and youth all across our region. And if I take you back to 2005, 2006, it really springs forth from understanding that something seismically different was happening in kids' lives. And today we now understand from the learning sciences that in fact something seismic was happening in their lives, that because of societal and technological reasons, kids were developing their identities differently, seeking affirmation differently, consuming and producing information differently. And we now know from brain science that their brains are actually developing differently. So the bets that we started making in this region nearly 15 years ago were these, that if in fact kids were developing differently, how did we have to think differently about the design of classroom spaces or other learning settings? How do we have to think differently about professional development and learning? How do we think differently about summer camp experiences or the experiences that young people have in out-of-school settings? So you have thousands of people, principals and teachers and librarians and youth workers and others who've been collectively working on any number of projects, experiences. There's been more than $100 million invested in southwestern Pennsylvania over the past 15 years to create a different type of learning landscape, and more importantly, a different type of adult. The way that we as adults are positioned to support our young people, whether it's as teachers or as other caring adults in our lives. Right. And particularly using these new pedagogies of technology-enhanced learning, of maker-centered learning, of technology-enhanced learning, of the frameworks and approaches that are attractive to young people, mindful about what their futures hold. And so it's that work over the past 15 years that is the storyline of this book. And being here in Western Pennsylvania, home of Fred Rogers, I go back to that equation. These people in many ways are modern-day Fred Rogers, who are connecting what's timeless and classic about learning with what is innovative, future-facing, and even radical.
Yeah. And you didn't say it explicitly, but I've got my phone right here, and we know that this is so much of what has changed the way that we shape, as adolescents. I'm curious because one of the things we talk about with our dads, right, is, and you talk about this balance of using this technology, right? We talk about how can you use your phone and use it as a tool because it does give us so many opportunities, abilities that we didn't have right in our pocket that we never had before, but rather than it using you. Right? Because so many, it's like a casino in here, and it gives us these little hits of dopamine when we get all this stuff. So I'm curious for adults and children, how you see that incorporating into the educational system.
Well, it begins by asking what's developmentally appropriate, right? This device here is nothing more than a pencil, the fire, the fulcrum, or the printing press.
Yep.
Right? So I think we need to think about things like this, especially things like this that are attractive for all sorts of reasons, and ask ourselves, are we using these in developmentally appropriate ways? They can be used in wondrous ways. We can take kids to Nazi Germany, to study the Holocaust and take them into that space and use VR and other technologies in really constructive ways
Right.
that then are facilitated by conversations, that are facilitated by caring adults and talking about a hard issue like that. Or we can use them in mindless, unhelpful, unconstructive ways. So I think it begins first and foremost by saying, how am I using these devices or these technologies in a way that enhance the learning experience in ways that are developmentally appropriate?
Let me
Fred
jump
used
on
to
that.
say-
Go ahead,
Oh,
Ryan. You go
I was
first.
just
And
going
then
to say, yeah, Fred used to say that the most important, or the television is most useful when it's turned off, right? Because it's when it's turned off after you've used it for whatever it is that you're using it for. You can sit with a child, or you can sit with yourself and be present. And I think a simple way to, or a simple rule for technology use, is to not let it get in the way of that all-important presence. There's a study that we cite in the book. The researchers at the University of Washington followed 800 kids from when they were in second grade all the way up until 2019, when they were in their mid-30s. And when they were kids, they'd been split into two groups. Parents and teachers of one group had gotten help building strong relationships. The parents and teachers of the control group hadn't had any intervention. And when the researchers compared the life trajectories of the two groups, they found that the group whose parents and teachers had had help building strong relationships, they were outperforming their peers on everything. They were making more money. They were more likely to be involved in their communities. They were more satisfied with life. They were even more healthy physically. And what the researchers boiled all of this down to was a very simple statement. It was, be present with your kids. Play with them every day. Don't just sit on your phone when you're with them. Give them as many experiences as possible to feel bonded to you. And I think as long as we can ensure that we don't let technology get in the way of those bonds being formed, that's generally a good guidepost to keep in mind.
Right. I love that idea. And I missed that one from the book about TV being most effective when it's turned off. And I think about the fast-paced nature. I know you talk a little bit about how Fred Rogers kind of slowed it down. It was, I think, 2 cuts per minute, or you said, which as a, as a production company owner, it's very interesting to me to go against the grain. And I think that we do need to take those times to slow down, right? I'm so grateful for a conversation like this, because it helps me digest a book, right, and think even more about it, and it in a way that you don't have if you're just reading a book and then kind of put it aside. These discussions help bring it to life and think about those applications, which you guys touched on in the What Might You Do section in there. But I'm curious if, so where do you, because I think it's difficult, right? And that was a big sigh in here, because this is, as a father, I guess this is the challenge that I think about, because in my mind, and looking at the news right now, there were people protesting against Facebook because they don't want them to come out basically with a kid's version of Instagram. And I think about this, like, part of me says, yes, I get that, because our kids are already, we want to prevent them from becoming addicted. Part of me thinks, yes, their brains are forming differently, so maybe because they've been exposed to this at such a young age, they'll be better equipped to deal with it in a way that my generation wasn't, because we didn't have the computer. And then the third aspect that I think is, well, I'm the parent, I need to control what my kids do, because it's no different than Elvis swinging his hips or curse words or whatever it might be for a different generation, that I need to be the parent and figure out how my kid is going to relate to that. So I'm curious how you guys think about that situation, and from both a parent standpoint and an educator standpoint.
Well, it goes back to what Ryan just said. Am I present as the caring adult in my daughter's lives together with my wife? Look, there are times that, maybe my wife and I finally get a chance, we're not working, and we're like, just watch your iPad, right? Like, I get that.
Right.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it can be a great toy, it can be a great learning moment. But it's also the case that with any toy, right, with any product, with any experience, like, I need to be present to understand, how is it that my daughters are using these things? When is the sort of mindless bored moment that actually is okay? And when is the moment that this could either go really well and allows my daughter to pursue her path, like, she has this, weird fascination with France, and so, like, she can use these devices to, transport herself to France. And when is this potentially a harmful space that is actually detrimental? And And it just requires that it's remembering that in that future facing, innovative, crazy, frenetic moment, the timeless classic role of caring adults never goes away.
Right.
And we need that relationship with our child and with the things in their lives.
Before I get to you, Ryan, as an educator from that standpoint, I just want to touch one more thing on that, Greg, because I acknowledge that wholeheartedly, but I think that we as adults who didn't grow up with this technology need to understand how to use it, right? And try and be cognizant of those addictive properties that go along with it, and make sure that we are using it so that we can teach our kids how to do that. I don't think a lot of adults know how to do that right now. And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there's the correlation, whether it's causation or not, between depression and isolation and things that go along with that from social media, are more prevalent in a previous generation than it will be in our children.
So I hear you, and I'm not pretending to be perfect, but
Right.
That's a perfect moment to acknowledge, like, I don't know what's exactly happening here, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've turned to my daughter and say, show me how you just did that, or show me what you're doing. It's okay to acknowledge, like, I don't know this software, I don't know this program, I don't know this device. Let's learn about it together. Show me.
Right. So it's the equivalent of me recording something on the VCR for my mom back in the day.
Sort of, yeah. Right? I mean, that's...
Yeah. And Ryan, I'm curious from an educator standpoint how you see this.
Yeah, so the science on technology and the impact of social media on kids is really mixed at this point. The negative outcomes tend to grab more headlines. It has been correlated with things like depression, and that's because of cyberbullying or tech addiction, things like that. But there are also a lot of positives. Technology and social media is where lots of kids find belonging. It's how they find people who let them know they matter. So it's hard. I think it's hard to make a value judgment on the technology itself. I will say my concern is that the more options we have for electronic connection, the more options we have for technology that stimulates us in one way or another, the fewer opportunities we have for silence, the fewer opportunities we have for quiet reflection, which was a huge part of Fred Rogers' personal life and a huge part of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. There's a statistic in our book that I think it's more than 70% of people have their best ideas in one place, and that's in the shower. And that's because the shower is the last place that we as adults just leave our brains alone, where we're not listening to music, where we're not checking our phone, where we're not dealing with the hundreds or thousands of daily responsibilities that are weighing on us all the time. And I think as we continue to crowd more platforms, more technology, more Instagrams for children into the market, I do worry about losing those opportunities to just be, to just let your mind wander where it will, because that's where wonder comes from. That's where creativity comes from. That's how we start asking ourselves the questions of who we are and what moves us and what drives us and what we really care about.
I feel like Go ahead, Greg, sorry.
And we also have to challenge our assumptions about these things, right? There have been some remarkable studies just in the recent months produced by the Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop, by Common Sense Media out of California, about the ways in which these devices and the platforms that kids are on have actually been helpful to tweens and teens during the course of the pandemic, that runs counter to most expectations and certainly our biases about these things. So as adults, we have to confront ourselves with this evidence and really understand and appreciate how fundamentally different our young people are and how they're engaging differently with these things that are omnipresent in their lives.
When we get offline here, I'm going to ask you if you can point me in the direction of some of those studies so I can share them with our audience there, because I think that's valuable. And you take all the information and then you weigh what works for you, I think is the best way to figure that out. I want to go back just for a second because Ryan touched on the 70% of people have their ideas in the shower. And I feel like my wife would get on me if I didn't mention that the 30% are probably moms out there, because I think as she was trying to take a shower today and my two kids are banging on the door going, "Mama, Mama," she was probably mid-thought in there. So I can empathize there with her. And
That's so funny.
yeah, I'll try and take him out of the house thinking about this next time when she hops in the shower. And then also, when you talk about social media, I don't want to ignore the positives, right? I don't want to be the old man, get off my lawn type of thing or yelling at the clouds, because there is a lot of positivity that goes on there. And I feel like you can kind of curate that experience. Foul mouth aside, right? Like I follow Gary Vee, and the positivity and finding yourself that he puts out there can be so valuable. And I feel like there are just as many motivational messages that maybe lose their meaning and have become cliche on social media, but still, those are the positive things that are out there. And as far as a resource of finding your community, I say it's never been easier. If you like to, I don't know, if you like water skiing squirrels and that's your community, you can find that community online, and you no longer have to be the outcast, right? And I was just listening to something about Weird Al, and I think about him in high school, how more people would have been able to find him and feel comfortable in their own skin. And ultimately, that's the goal from all of this, because that's going to, I think, give you the healthiest mindset and upbringing. So I think we touched on so much from the book. I have one question I end with, but before I do, I want to ask anything that you gentlemen want to touch on before I get to my last question that you think might be important. Obviously, we'll point people to the website, whenyouvwonderyourlearning.org. You can find out more about the book there. But Gregg, Ryan, anything else before I get to my last question?
I would just say, because you just said it, the idea of feeling comfortable in your own skin. You said that gives you the best mindset. Absolutely. Rogers was once asked, how would you describe the neighborhood? What is it? And he said something really interesting. He called it an atmosphere. He said the neighborhood is an atmosphere in which people can feel safe enough to be who they are. That was his entire mission in creating Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And that is the mission of the many people we profile in the book who are following in Fred's footsteps in ways that are authentic to them and attractive to kids and meaningful for learning. So thank you for bringing that up. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I grew up in Brooklyn, right? I'm still in Brooklyn, and there was a certain pride and affiliation that came from living here that I didn't really understand. And to be honest, it was the neighborhood, right? You knew everybody on your block. If my mom needed a cup of sugar or needed somebody to watch me for a few minutes, then she had that support system. If someone across the street needed me to shovel them out during a snowstorm, she would kick my butt out the door and say, go help out, type of thing. And so that's what I loved unknowingly about growing up in Brooklyn. And I think we are losing that a little bit. I think the pandemic kind of forced people inside, but I will do everything I can to foster that in my community and try and bring it back out a little bit, because you're right. That's a feeling of safety. That is a safety net, having that neighborhood behind you. And then you can free your mind up to think about other things, to wonder and be a little bit more curious in there. So my last question, gentlemen, and I ask this of everyone, and because we are the Dad Habit, we focus on small habit changes that can have big results. So I'm curious for the two of you, is there one habit that you have in your life that you think has paid ultimately positive dividends over and over again that our audience might benefit from? And I saw Ryan go deep into thought there. He was like, oh, what is it? Either one of you, if there's something that jumps to mind.
So for my girls, I've decided that if I have one task in life, it's to make sure that they just have confidence about who they are, about what they want to be, and to know that they belong and can pursue what it is that they want. So I will tell you, I don't do this as often as I used to, but after, when they were a bit younger and, showers would end, I always had this little thing I'd say to them, I'm drying them off, and I'd say, I love your knees. I love your toes. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting it. I love your knees. I love your nose. I especially love your little toes. But what I really like is your good heart, your strong muscles, your smart brain, and that you're beautiful. And it was just like our little thing. And we would do it every night after bath and shower time. And I do think those messages of conveying, I just think it's so important, and especially for our girls, as dads, of conveying those messages.
I love it. Ryan, anything that pops to mind for you?
This is a habit that I'm trying to get into as a result of studying Fred Rogers, of having the privilege of immersing myself in the neighborhood for so long. And that is letting go of the idea that being a good person or a good dad or a good teacher is something you are or you're not. And this goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. being good, being a neighbor is a daily practice. It's something you wake up every day and decide to do. And it's something you go to bed every night and just think about how you did and how you're going to improve the next day. I think the more we can get rid of these, you're either good or you're not, and commit ourselves to doing the work of a lifetime's worth of improvement, not only will we be better at whatever it is we're endeavoring to do, we will lead a more fulfilling human life while we're at it.
I love it, man. Ryan Rydzewski, Gregg Behr, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, the book is When You Wonder You're Learning. Check it out on the website, whenyouwonderyou'relearning.org. Gentlemen, it was really a pleasure. Feel free anytime to drop us a line because I love talking with you guys.
So much fun to be with you. Thank you for having us.
Awesome. Have
Thank
a
you
great
so
day,
much.
gentlemen. And if you're listening out there, please don't forget to like, follow, especially share if you think that you or someone else that you know could benefit from this conversation. And if there's somebody else that you'd like to hear from that you think our community might benefit from, as always, please feel to reach out. It's joe@thedadhabit.com. For this edition of Dad Hab Live, Tyler working the boards. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time. Have a great day, everybody.